What's up everyone? Today we're going to be building out the My Properties screen. So let's get started. Here I'm in my server code. So I'm just going to head to my property route and we're going to add two new functions to this route. So our first function is going to be called get properties by user ID, and it's going to take in a context, and we need to get the ID passed in with the parameters. So based upon that ID, we need to query our database for all of the properties associated with that user ID, and we need to get the apartments associated with those properties as well. And if we get an error during this, we'll send the user that we got an error. Otherwise, we will just send the user the properties. Now let's head to main.go and let's register a new get endpoint. And we are going to have it be user ID followed by the user ID, and we'll point it to the function that we just created. Now go back to property, and next we need to create a function called delete property. It's going to take in a context as well, and it's also going to have parameters which contain an ID, except that this ID is going to be for the property. And based upon that ID, we're going to delete the property within our database, which has that ID. And then if we get an error, we're going to send the user that we got an error. Otherwise, we will just send them a status code of 204, which means no content. Now let's go back to main.go. And here we're going to register a new delete endpoint, which will just expect an ID for the parameters. And we will pass it the delete property function that we just created. So those are all the changes that we're going to make to our server in this video. So just start it up. And now let's navigate to our application code. So here I am in my constants file. And before we get started on building out any UI, let's add our new endpoints to this endpoints object. So the first one is going to be get properties by user ID. And the second will be delete property. So with those added, let's go ahead and create our new screen. So go into your screens folder and create a new one called MyPropertiesScreen. And in it, let's import style sheet, text, and screen, and then export your component, returning a screen with some text which just says My Properties Screen for now. And beneath that, let's create our styles. Now let's go into our index file and add this screen to the navigation. And this is going to be in the modal stat group. So down at the bottom here, beneath edit property, let's add a new screen with the name of My Properties. The component is going to be the My Properties screen, and the options are going to have a header shown as false. And let's import this screen. Now let's go to our types file. And underneath edit property, let's add My Properties, and it's going to be undefined. And then one thing we forgot to do in last video is just get rid of this property ID. So this is going to be undefined for add property. Now with that done, let's head to the account screen so that we can navigate to the My Properties screen. So let's go there, and then pretty much anywhere where it says view my properties or view my residences, we're just going to navigate to the My Properties screen. So here we'll say navigation.navigate to My Properties. Let's say that one. Here where it says my residences, we'll do the same thing. And then for the last rental management buttons, here where it says view my properties, we will do the same thing. And with that implemented, let's go to the account screen and test it out. And it seems to be working. So let's start to build out the UI for this screen. So in getting started on building out the My Properties screen, let's first navigate there, and then let's import a few new items. So the first one is going to be use navigation from React Navigation. Next is going to be the use query hook from React Query. And then let's go create some new variables. So we'll say const navigation is equal to use navigation. And then we also need to import the use auth hook from our local hooks because we want to know if there's a user. So here we'll say const user is equal to use auth. And if no user exists, then we will return to the user that they need to go to the sign up or sign in screen. So that's going to auto import for us. Now underneath the user, let's create a new query. It's going to be called properties, and we'll give it the key of MyProperties. And for the function, we need to see if the user is available and exists. And if they are, we need to make a GET request to get all of the properties by the user ID, passing in the user's ID. Now let's import Axios and endpoints and properties, or property. And I'm going to move this up. And underneath this user condition, let's make a new condition so that if the properties query is loading or is fetching, we will return the loading component. So let's import that from our local components as well. In our screen component, let's create a new condition to check if properties.data.data exists and its length is greater than 0. Then we will just return a text component with the JSON stringified of the property data. So within this, we'll say JSON.stringify properties.data.data. And if it doesn't exist, we will just return this text. So let me clean this up a bit. And here we go. So here we can see that I have one property for this specific user. So that looks good and all. We're actually getting data. So now we just need to make this data look pretty so that the user can interact with it. So to get started with that, let's import flat list from React Native. And instead of displaying these stringified properties, let's display a flat list instead. And the data for this flat list is going to be equal to this property data. We are going to want to render a card, so let's render that out. And here we can see that we are getting an error because this current property does not have the rent low field. So let's go to our card, and we're going to go to the card information and make some changes here. And now we need to make a condition so that we only render this row if property rent low exists and property rent high exists. Here we'll say property.tags ? else null. Now here we can change this to a capital ID. So with those changes made, we can now see what our card looks like. Now we aren't going to want to display this for whenever the property owner is looking at the card. They aren't going to want to email themselves or call themselves. And if there isn't an image, we'd like to show that there is no image. So I'm just going to go to my web browser and search for an image which specifies that no image exists, and go ahead and download one of these images, whichever you see fit. I downloaded mine and placed it into my assets folder. and I called it no image. That's important because if we go into the card again and then we go to our image carousel, we're going to want to display that no image whenever no images exist. So here, let's say images, and images.length is greater than 0, and that's when we're going to want to render out the flat list. Otherwise, we are going to want to render out a pressable image, which displays the image that we just downloaded. So for that, we need to specify, we need to require the image within our assets folder, in the images folder, and the name of that image was noimage.jpg. So noimage.jpg. And here we can see that we are now displaying that there is no image. So that is working. Now we just need to change the information shown about the card. So that's going to be in the card information component. And currently this stuff is what we want to display whenever the property is not owned by a specific user. So let's just abstract this into its own little component. We'll call that default info. And here we're just gonna return a fragment. And within that fragment, we're gonna have everything within here, within this view. So let's cut that and paste it in here. And now within this view, we're going to say my property, and we need to make that a prop within this component. So let's add it, my property, and that should be optional, and it's going to be a Boolean. So my property question mark else, then we want to display default info. Now for what we want to display when it's my property, that component is going to be called MyPropertiesInfo. So let's finish out this conditional logic, and then we can start to build out the MyPropertiesInfo. So here, let's say MyPropertiesInfo. And so that we can see it whenever we're building it, let's go and add this to the image carousel. Or no, it's going to be in the card. So we're going to have to pass down through this card the MyProperty prop. And then here in MyPropertiesScreen, let's say that my property is true. And here for card information, we'll say that my property is equal to my property. Okay, so now we can actually start to build out this MyPropertiesInfo component. We need to render out some text, and if the property has a name, then we will just display that name. Otherwise, we will display the address. So let's import getState abbreviation here. And underneath that, we'll create a new row, and we'll create a new style for this row called rowLine, which aligns items to center. And if the property has apartments, we need to display the number of units. And next to that, we will display a button which says manage units. Next, let's import divider from UIKitten. And underneath our row, let's display a divider, and that style is just going to have a background color of theme color-gray. And finally, underneath that, we'll display a row, and within that row, we'll have text displaying whether or not the property is on the market, and a button to activate or deactivate depending on its current market status. And of course, we need to go into our property type and add this field. and it's going to be an optional Boolean. So here above below stars rather, we will add that field, and that's going to be a Boolean. Now let's go back. So now we just need to go into the card again. Whenever this card is shown, we want to show an ellipses in the top right of the card so that the user can press on that and either edit the property or delete the property. So that's really only going to exist on this card whenever my property is present. So let's add that in. So here we're going to need to import touchable opacity from React Native, and then import material community icons. And underneath card information, we will make a condition, and if my property is true, we will display a touchable opacity, which is just a material community icon of an ellipses. And whenever that gets pressed, we need to open a modal, which will display edit property and delete property. And let's create the style for that. The name for this is going to be ellipses, and it's going to have these different fields. And now we just need to import theme and create the open modal state, or rather that's going to be a function, but it's going to turn on and off a state. So let's import useState from React. And then let's create our state variable for showing the modal. The function open modal is going to set show modal to true, and then close modal will set show modal to false. And there we can see the ellipses in the top right of the card. So now whenever that gets pressed, we just need to display a modal. So we need to import modal from UIKitten, and we're going to import button as well. Now underneath this condition, we'll display a modal, and that's going to have a style of backdrop, which just sets the background color to this. And within that modal, we'll have a view, which has this for the styles. And then within that, we'll have two buttons, one for editing the property and one for deleting the property. So now we just need to import view, and this should work. So let's test that out. And here we can see that it works. Now we just need to create the functions for whenever the user presses edit property and delete property. So when the user presses edit property, we're going to want to take them to the edit property screen. So let's import use navigation and create your navigation variable. Then create a function called handle edit property, which navigates to the edit property screen, passing in the property ID, and then calls close modal. And now for the edit property button, let's pass that in for the onPress function. So that's handle edit property. And for the delete property, we need to create a new mutation. So let's go and import use mutation. And we're also going to need to import use query client. Now let's create our query client. And we need to import Axios as well, along with our endpoints. And let's change this to spell correctly. Now let's create the delete property mutation. For the function, we're going to call the delete property endpoint, passing in the property ID. And for the onMutate function, we are going to optimistically update the MyProperties query. So we need to cancel all queries for MyProperties and then get the previous properties. And if that exists, then we need to filter out for the current property ID and then set MyProperties to the filtered array. And at the end, we will return the previous properties. And if an error occurs and previous properties exist, then we would like to set my properties to the previous properties. And whenever this is settled, we need to invalidate the queries for my properties. Now we'll create a function for deleting the property, which we'll just call deleteProperty.mutate and then close the modal. And let's pass that in for the onPress event for the delete property button. So handle delete property. And let's test this out. So whenever we delete that, we get shown the MyProperties screen. And now we just need to build out this screen so that it says, hey, you don't have any properties, go and add some. So that's going to be back in the MyProperties screen. And also we're going to need to fill out some more of this flat list. So let's do that before we change anything. So for the key extractor, we are going to be using the ID. So item, and then item.id.toString. Shows vertical scroll indicator is going to be false. And that about sums it up for right now. We're going to add a list header, but first let's get this squared away. So instead of displaying this text, let's render out a fragment. And within this, we'll have a modal header. The X is going to be shown, and the text will read the text that you've put. So here, let's import it. Now let's import view. And we already have text here, so I think that's all we'll need. No, we'll need button as well. And we have navigation, so we should be good. And we'll also need Lottie view, so that's going to be from Lottie React Native. And underneath this, we'll render out a view. Within this view, we'll have a Lottie, which is just going to be set to the add property Lottie that we got in an earlier video. And let's go and add some styles to that. So that's going to have these styles. And we're going to need to add a style to this view. And it will have a margin top of 30 and margin horizontal of 10. So let's add that. Properties. Now underneath the Lottie, let's display some text saying you have no properties and add a property and start renting. Those are going to have these different styles. And underneath that text, let's add a button to navigate to the add property screen. And that button will have a margin top of 20. Now we can click it and add a new property. And now we can go to the view my properties, and there we can see it. So above this list, we'd like to display two buttons, one for refreshing the properties and then one for adding a new property. So we will access that through the list header component for the flat list. So for this, we'll need to import Untypo from Expo Vector Icons. We'll need to import theme. And we'll also need to import material community icons. And because we are going to have a button to add another property, let's just create a function which navigates to that screen, and then we can reuse it. Here we'll say add property navigation, and then down below we can just call that here. And we're going to be recalling it in here. So with that done, we'll create a button, and it will have an accessory left of Untypo, and pretty much whenever it's pressed, we need to call add property navigation to add a new property. And let's go and create the style for this. It will just align self to flex start and have a margin vertical of 5. And underneath that, we will just have a button to refetch, which just calls properties.refetch when it's pressed. So let's go and add a new property. And let's go back to view my properties, and there we can see we just need to add a little space to the cards and we should be good. So here in these styles, let's create one for the card, and that's just going to have a margin vertical of 10, and let's go and add that to the card. So style is equal to styles.card. And we need to actually pass in an onPress function to the card so that whenever it's pressed, it navigates to this certain property. So for the onPress event, we will just navigate to the edit property screen, passing in the ID of the property. And let's test that out. And there we go. And let's delete a property real quick. And here we can delete another one. And there we go. So that's how you can add the MyPropertiesScreen into your app. Thanks for watching.